Hello, anatomy students. Today we're going to talk about the blood. Now, I know that it says on the slide that we're talking about the circulatory system. The blood is considered a part of the circulatory system, but in this unit, we're talking about the blood and the immune system instead. We'll talk about the circulatory system after we talk about these two aspects of blood. All right, so let's take a look today at the functions and at the components of blood. So blood is going to be carried throughout the body by the circulatory system, which is basically a pipeline of blood vessels. The functions of the blood are to transport things like oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the body and to transport waste products away from the tissues of the body. It's going to offer some protection. That's what we're going to talk about when we talk about immunity and also regulation. So remember that there are sensors that we have throughout the body. The hypothalamus is going to sense changes in the components of the blood, like whether it's the pH level or oxygen levels or carbon dioxide levels. And then it's going to stimulate change through its hormone secretions in that way. So, the blood is actually a connective tissue. It's the only liquid connective tissue that we have in the body. And the liquid component of blood is called plasma. It's mostly water. And then suspended inside of this plasma, we have the formed elements. We have cells and we have platelets, which are not considered cells in and of themselves because they don't have organelles. So some different cells that we have here in the picture are monocytes, neutrophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and eosinophils. You'll notice that some of them are highlighted in pink and some of them are highlighted in green. That's because the cells of the blood are going to be classified according to what their cytoplasm looks like underneath the microscope. So anything in pink is something that's called a granulocyte because you can actually see little dots in the cytoplasm called granules, and they contain different chemicals depending on which cell you're looking at. And then the ones that are green are agranulocytes. So it doesn't mean that they don't have granules. It just means that they don't pick up a dye, so you don't really see the speckles inside of the cytoplasm when you look at them underneath a microscope. Then we have platelets, which are fragments of cells, and we also have erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells. And we're going to talk about each of these and their different structures and functions. Okay, so this is something that's called a hematocrit. And so one thing that happens when you go to a doctor's office is they'll draw your blood and to see if you have the right amount of components, for instance, they'll take that blood, put it into one of these tubes, and then they put it into a centrifuge, which is a spinner, and it just uses the force of the centripetal force to pull the formed elements, the cells, down towards the bottom of the tube, and then the liquid portion of the blood rises to the top. And so that's what we're seeing here. So about 55% of blood content is plasma. You have less than 1% as white blood cells and platelets, and that's going to form like a little band of white in between the top liquid portion and then the bottom red blood cell portion. This is called the buffy coat. And then, whoops, sorry. And then the erythrocytes are forming the rest of the blood. So you have many more erythrocytes than you do white blood cells and platelets. And then if we look at just the plasma itself, which was that very top portion of the tube that we saw on the previous screen, sorry, that is this portion right here, then we're looking at the protein concentration of that blood plasma. So the blood plasma is made up mostly of albumin, that's about 60%, globulins, which are 35%, and then fibrinogens, which are 4%. And then, of course, like there's some other things too that that don't occur as often, or they're not as abundant. The albumin is going to act largely as carrier proteins for different hormones that are cholesterol based. Globulins, we're going to talk a lot about when we talk about our immune system. And then fibrinogens are proteins that are dissolved in the blood plasma, but they're going to play a very large role in blood clot formation, which we'll talk about in the process of hemostasis. This is just something that is interesting to know. So, hemopoiesis is the creation or the synthesis of blood cells, and it starts even before birth. It starts in the yolk sac where we have stem cells. And then these stem cells are going to move out to various developing tissues in the embryonic body. And then after birth, hemopoiesis is going to move largely to the bone marrow and to the lymphatic tissues. And so all of the cells are going to start off in the bone marrow, but the lymphocytes, the cells that play a really big role in the immune system, they're going to leave the bone marrow and differentiate and mature in different tissues in the body. We say that the stem cells are pluripotent, which means that they can develop multiple types of blood cells. Myeloid hemopoiesis is happening in the bone marrow, and we're going to get various types of cells that are coming from the bone marrow: red blood cells and platelets, granulocytes, and monocytes. So another thing to just keep in mind is that granulocytes and monocytes are different from red blood cells. So these are some of the white blood cells. And then we have lymphoid hemopoiesis, which happens largely in lymphoid tissue around the body. And that's how lymphocytes are going to be formed. So the lymphocytes, like B cells and T cells, they have origins that are different from monocytes, granulocytes, red blood cells, and platelets. So let's talk about red blood cells. They don't have any organelles, and that is to ensure that they have plenty of room for a compound called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin contains four groups, which are called heme groups. They have iron in them, and that is what's going to bind to oxygen and allow these red blood cells to carry oxygen around the body to the tissues of the body. They don't have any mitochondria, because if they had mitochondria, they would be kind of eating the profits, so to speak. So they don't have mitochondria because mitochondria would use that oxygen in order to produce ATP. So red blood cells don't have mitochondria. Well, if they don't have nuclei, they don't have mitochondria, they don't have any other kind of organelles, they can't possibly live very long. And that's the truth. They only stay in circulation for about 120 days, and then they are cleared out by the liver or by the spleen. What they do have a lot of is hemoglobin. So they're really just like these pillows of hemoglobin. And they have an abundance of cytoskeletal proteins, and that's going to allow them to squeeze into the tiniest possible places, which are very important. I'm sure that you've heard somewhere along the way that capillaries are only one cell thick. Well, that is enough to allow a red blood cell to squeeze through them. And so we need to have these proteins in order to allow these blood cells to be pliable. And as you can see here, we're looking at like a cross section of the blood cells. So it's got a flattened center because the nucleus has been not removed, but kind of like spit out during development. And so they've got a flattened center and then kind of bulging on the outside. So like they would kind of look like I don't know, like a lifesaver, I guess, but like not a hole in the middle. Like it's kind of got a thinner membrane in the middle, but it's got a depression in the middle of it. Okay, so this is a molecule of hemoglobin. We have four protein chains, which are called globins, and they are going to bind to carbon dioxide. But I do want to mention that most of the carbon dioxide in the body is transported, dissolved in the blood. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about the respiratory system. But the other thing that it contains are four heme groups, which I've got highlighted here on the picture. These heme groups, each one of them binds to one oxygen molecule. So every hemoglobin molecule has the capability of carrying four oxygen molecules. You're probably like, well, that's not really that much, except that every red blood cell has millions of these molecules inside of them. So it it works for our bodies. And so I just wanted to show you this again. This is more of a nice to know. You can see that red blood cell formation, erythropoiesis, is happening in the red bone marrow of our bones as a child. Or an infant, here it says less than 1 year. Almost all of the bones contain red bone marrow, but then as an adult, the red bone marrow is restricted largely to the axial skeleton and also like the flat bones, like of the pelvis, of the shoulder girdle. And red blood cell formation is going to occur with the help of a hormone that comes from the kidneys called erythropoietin, which is abbreviated as EPO. And it's going to respond largely to oxygen levels. So as oxygen levels fall, that's sensed here in the kidneys. The kidneys are going to respond by secreting more erythropoietin, and that's going to stimulate for the production not only of more red blood cells, but also for the production of more hemoglobin, so that we can pick up as much oxygen that as possible that we breathe, that we inhale, and then transport that around to our tissues. And so this is just showing you how hypoxia or low oxygen levels are going to induce the kidneys and the liver to, I didn't mention liver, but to secrete EPO. And then that's going to stimulate our bone marrow to create more red blood cells, to accelerate hemoglobin synthesis, and to speed the maturation also of those red blood cells. And then this is just the EPO feedback loop. So hypoxia causes the kidneys and the liver to increase production of EPO that stimulates the bone marrow to increase red blood cell production, which increases the amount of hemoglobin that we have in our blood and thus our oxygen transport. And that means that we're going to get more oxygen in tissues. But here's where the negative feedback portion of this loop comes in. When our oxygen levels rise, that's going to feed back to the kidneys and the liver, and then they are going to decrease the amount of erythropoietin that they are secreting, thereby slowing down all of the processes that you see here because we don't need it anymore. So our red blood cells are going to lead short and busy lives. So let's take a look at this video. Hi. I just saw my counter and I'm not going to be able to finish the video in the amount of time that I have left in this recording. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it here and I'll start part two with playing that video. Anyway, sorry about that. Thanks. Bye.